Hello friends. I think there is no denying that it has been a pretty crappy week. For me, there have been two major issues and topics that have been breaking my heart and occupying most of my waking thoughts. The first, obviously, are the war crimes and genocide that Israel is committing against Palestine. And the second is the emphatic no that the Australian public said in response to the Voice referendum last weekend. Neither of these events exist in a vacuum. They both have so much history and context attached to them. And also, both of them exist within colonial oppressive structures. To me, I think it's pretty clear that these two topics share a lot of similarities and are inherently interwoven. To express solidarity with one group and not the other, to me, is just like, it doesn't make sense. It's utterly hypocritical. And I think there was something really jarring for a lot of us to see our Prime Minister really pushing for a yes vote to the referendum for the Voice, while in the next breath explicitly saying that he and Australia support 100% unconditionally Israel and apartheid colonial state's right to defend itself from the indigenous people that it is occupying. So on top of going to rallies and emailing my representatives, calling my representatives, donating money, supporting local Palestinian businesses, I have also been reading this week. Not a lot. I read 4 books, one by an Aboriginal author, one by a Palestinian author, and then 2 other books that I just felt were relevant and that I needed to read right now. So I wanted to talk you through those, what I've been reading this week and why. And then also I have some other recommendations for you. So let's just kind of like lean into the big feelings that a lot of us are having right now, and let's talk about some books that I've been reading to learn more, to support authors, and to sustain myself for the long haul, because that's what solidarity is. So the first book that I read this week is one I've been wanting to read for ages. It's White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. Ruby is an Australian. She is staunchly pro-Palestine. I've been following her on Instagram for a long time, and she is very explicit with her opinions and her thoughts. So I knew what I was getting into when I picked up this book, and it was incredible. This book was so good. I do feel like this book is written in a lot of ways for people of color and particularly women of color, but I also think it's a very accessible and important book for white people, especially white women, to read. Ruby starts with the experience of white woman tears, which, I mean, is probably a phrase you've heard before, where white women in situations where their power is challenged or their perception of themselves is challenged in some way by a person of color, they weaponize their perceived innocence by society. And especially for white women, that often comes in the form of tears. So it takes that kind of phenomenon of white woman tears and white feminism and how harmful that can be, sometimes in very obvious ways, but sometimes in more insidious ones. And it explores how and why this happens and also the history of it. I think for me, some of the things that were so powerful about this book was the reframing of white women in colonial history. I think the narrative as someone living in Australia that we often hear now that we're kind of like starting to vaguely accept that maybe colonialism was a little bit violent sometimes, is that violence was perpetrated by men and men alone, and that the white women who were part of this colony were just kind of like innocent bystanders, and in fact they were often victims of the colony as well, because patriarchy, right? And while yes, patriarchy does harm women, including white women, Ruby details some pretty explicit examples of how white women actively participated in colonialism. And I think in particular one of the examples that she gave that was really poignant and sharp was how white women participated in atrocities such as the Stolen Generation. Weaponizing their position as innocent, pure, and good mothers allowed them to maintain a proximity to the power of whiteness and white men by making themselves useful in the process of dispossession and genocide. Another kind of topic, or almost archetype, I suppose you could say, that Ruby tackles in this book is the concept of the damsel in distress, and how it was a very intentional, active choice on the part of white supremacy and those wanting to create and uphold a system of white supremacy to position white women as pure, as innocent, in needing of defense and protection against the barbaric natives or black people, depending on which part of the world you are in. That was used in part, yes, to control white women's bodies and their sexuality, but it was done ostensibly to protect white women against people of color. And it is that archetype that a lot of white women are kind of tapping into when they weaponize things like white tears. And while Ruby makes it very clear how harmful this is to people of color around the world, she also makes it clear how participating in the system, the choice for white women to align themselves more with whiteness and white men rather than women of color, only perpetuates and deepens their own oppression. She also talks about how white supremacy and the weaponization of white womanhood has been used to dehumanize so many populations, including Arabs and Muslims. White people assign themselves all the virtues they deny us: goodness, morality, intelligence, civilization, innocence and will viciously defend this innocence against anyone who dares to challenge it. And I think that's very relevant to the way that Israel is positioning itself at the moment, and the West is choosing to position Israel at the moment, and the particular language that was used to describe Israelis and their suffering, who the West sees and perceives as white, even if that whiteness is somewhat conditional. And I'm sure many of you who are in support of Palestine have had the same conversation time and time again over the last couple of weeks, which is like this constant demand to condemn Hamas and Hamas only. And literally the attack by Hamas was described as unprovoked, which those of us who know anything about Palestine know is not true. That's not to say we're thrilled when civilians die, but like to call it unprovoked is like patently false. And when you try to explain that to people, when you try to give them a bit of context by explaining even just the violences within this last year, let alone talking about the last 75 years, I have had so many people, even people that I love, respond with, there is no excuse for violence. And yet literally in the next breath, they will turn around and defend what Israel is doing. And they don't see this as a contradiction. They do not see it as hypocritical to not apply the same to Israel and the response by Israel, which has been absolutely disproportionate. And I think Ruby and this book absolutely hit the nail on the head in kind of exploring some of the reasons why and how people can so easily come to this like clearly hypocritical view. And it is because they see Israelis as white and therefore inherently innocent, whereas they see Palestinians as non-white and therefore they are not granted that inherent innocence, even though 50% of Gaza are children. So this book was just so good. And although like Ruby is not Palestinian, she was born in Lebanon, she lives in Australia. And if like me, you're kind of struggling with some of the ways in which the white people around you are responding to this violence and this genocide, and you kind of have a vague understanding of why some of what is happening in terms of the framing and the language, but you just want a little bit more help getting there and understanding it even more, like I think that this is an absolutely powerful and worthwhile book to read at the moment. Utterly brilliant and necessary reading. So after White Tears, Brown Scars, the next book that I read was Rifqa by Mohammed El-Kurd. This is a poetry collection I've had on my shelf I think since earlier in the year. I did find myself reading non-fiction that I had audiobooks to and poetry this week. That was just kind of like where my concentration levels were at. And so while I'm not usually like a big poetry reader, I loved this. So Rifqa, the name, is actually the name of Muhammad's grandmother. And it says on the back that she was older than Israel itself and an icon of Palestinian resistance. This collection was beautiful, but it was very intense. It was angry, it was passionate, and there were plenty of poems in here that I loved and plenty of, particular lines that just really stood out to me, and I did end up underlining a bunch. A couple of my favorite lines were, "Violence is not children taking on dragons. TV said her brother was a martyr, but martyrs go with intent. He went bullet to the head. Here we know two sons, Earth's friend and white phosphorus. Here we know two things, death and the few breaths before it. What do you say to children for whom the Red Sea doesn't part?" One of the longer poems is called Rifqa, and there were just so many moments in this poem that just made me stop. And it's a poem kind of talking about Rifqa's experience being dispossessed in 1948 in the Nakba, and then his own experience when he's a young boy being displaced from his home too. So it's quite a long poem, it's several pages, but I'll read you just a couple of my favorite moments. "Invaders come back once again, claimed the land with fists and fire, excuses, beliefs of the chosen and the promised, as if God is a real estate agent. It was opened for them, not us. The colonizers, youthful, differently clothed, rifles smacking against their hips. Terrorist nation, celebrated stolen property, callous. I cried, not for the house, but for the memories I could have had inside it." And as much as I enjoyed the poetry, I also just really, really enjoyed the afterword as well. In here, he's talking about how when he was first writing, he trained himself to use unbiased words. This phenomenon is common among writers writing about Palestine, writers who worship the mythology of objectivity instead of satirizing it. There's this naive belief that Palestinians will acquire credibility once they've amassed respectability. I did this to appear rational and unhostile. The truth, however, is very hostile. And then just a paragraph later, he's talking about the humanization of Israelis and the dehumanization of Palestinians. "The world can grieve Israeli loss without qualifiers, despite the disparities in death toll. In contrast, we must qualify our death with reminders of their non-violence, humane professions, and disabilities. A Palestinian man cannot just die. For him to be mourned, he must be in a wheelchair, or developmentally delayed, a medical professional, or noticeably elderly at the very least. Even then, there are questions about the validity of his victimhood. So an amazing collection of poetry. I absolutely loved it. I was so moved by it, and it just felt so strong. And I don't just mean in terms of like the technical poetry aspect, but I mean like his spirit just feels so strong in the words on the page. The next book was actually a reread for me. And now this is not necessarily a book that I want to like say that I'm recommending right now, but it was a book that I just felt like I needed to return to. And that is Standing at the Edge by Joan Halifax. This is a book that I read with my book club, my Patreon book club, the Blossom Book Club, years ago. And while I remember not agreeing with everything in this book, there were a couple of moments throughout the book that I just found very helpful for me personally. Essentially, this book is about Joan Halifax's experience as an activist, as a nonviolent activist, and as a Zen Buddhist. And she's identified several kind of states that she calls edge states. And basically these states are often ones that we think of as exclusively good, but as she explores throughout the book that they each have their own shadow side. And so that's what she means by edge states. She means that like finding their kind of true point is like a little bit of a balancing act. So for example, one of the edge states is altruism, and falling over the edge of altruism means falling into pathological altruism. Falling over the edge state of empathy is empathic distress. Falling over the edge of integrity is moral suffering. Falling over the edge of engagement is burnout. The chapter that I got the most out of the first time and the second time coming back to it now is the chapter on empathy. I think especially the way that she frames empathy in contrast to compassion. I think empathy, especially in like the last 10 years or so, has kind of been put up on this pedestal as like this ideal state. And yet I don't think we talk about enough how, as she describes in this book, empathy is both a gift and an intrusion. And I think too, especially in activist circles or progressive circles or liberal circles even, sometimes a sense of empathy is used to justify not taking action, whether that's because somebody has fallen over the edge and is in empathic distress, but they often don't recognize it as empathic distress. They think it's still empathy, even though they have become essentially useless to the people that they are feeling empathy towards. Or I think it is all too easy for people, especially in privileged positions, to convince themselves that they are doing something just by feeling empathy, as if that is all that is needed when people are in need of help or assistance or solidarity or support. And I have to admit, earlier on in the week, I think I was slipping into empathic distress and just feeling quite overwhelmed by, you know, the state of the world and feeling quite helpless and hopeless in it all, which like is valid, right? Like the world is kind of shitty and there's only so much each of us can do, and it's frustrating. But equally, kind of dwelling in that place is not useful. It's not useful to me as a human being, and it's also not useful to the people that I'm feeling empathy towards. And so what I'm trying to do now is allow my empathy and my deep sense of connection to suffering to motivate me, to help me be very specific about what my values are and what I care about, so that I'm like acting in alignment with those things. And so when I'm feeling that kind of empathy edge state, like tipping over into an unhealthy place, trying to reframe my experience into one of compassion instead. Because although, like I said, empathy has been put up on some pedestal, we all like to think that we're super empathetic all the time, it's not always the best place from which to act. And basically, Joan says, empathic distress might serve as an instigating force that pushes us into compassionate action to end suffering of others and ourselves. We need some degree of arousal, some level of discomfort in order to mobilize our compassion. We just need to be sure we don't get stuck in the swamp of distress, because it can exhaust us and drive us away from caring for others. So that chapter in particular, I think, just kind of like helped me settle back into where I need to be rather than being overwhelmed and being in this state of empathic distress and just like so distraught by what I'm seeing online and what I'm feeling about what I'm seeing online. And I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about people who are like either in Gaza right now or in Palestine, or who, you know, have relatives there or have a direct relationship with Palestine in some way. But for me, as somebody who is very much in a position of solidarity specifically, I think it's important for us to focus on caring for ourselves and caring for our empathy in a way that sets us up to be in solidarity, in a way that's actually useful, in a way that's actually helpful long term. That's not to say that we will always be perfect at finding that tightrope, but kind of revisiting this book and revisiting that chapter in particular is just kind of like helping me at least try to find that balance, because it's very hard to act from a place of hopelessness. After that, I read another poetry collection. Well, this is kind of a mix of poetry, memoir, reportive, fiction, satire, and critique. But it gives poetry collection vibes, you know? It is Blakwork by Allison Whittaker. And I will be honest, this was not my favorite collection of poetry in terms of like the flow and all of that sort of stuff. I'm not a big poetry reader, so maybe some of this stuff just kind of went over my head in terms of the formatting and the experimentation of it. Also, I don't feel like this is a collection that is kind of for white people necessarily. She's not deliberately delivering her poetry and her work through a white lens, or like trying to make it accessible to a white lens. And so I think there was just stuff in here that just kind of like wasn't for me, and that went over my head. Some of the formatting stuff I just like didn't understand, and so I didn't know how to read the poem. But I mean, this has like a really high rating on GoodReads. I've heard wonderful things about it from other people, so I think it's just a me thing. Having said that though, there were some moments in this that were just incredible. I mean, the very first poem is called Blakwork, and it's basically kind of talking about the burden on Black people in Australia, on Aboriginal people, that white people have placed on them for this idea of reconciliation. And the poem ends with, "Indentured Blakwork, something like 9 to 5 forgiving you." And I just thought that that was like a real punch right in the first poem. It was brilliant. Essentially a call out to like the 24/7 free labor that so many Aboriginal people have like been expected to do in the name of reconciliation. So basically a book that I'm glad I read, and I would still highly recommend it if you can get your hands on it. Now let's talk briefly about some other book recommendations that I have for you at the moment. These are all books that I've read over the last few years. I'll start first with the books about Palestine, and then I'll go into books by Aboriginal authors. So I did post on my Instagram, and I think over here on YouTube too, about 2 of my favorite books of all time. The first is Palestinian Walks by Raja Shahade. There's an audiobook available. We read it as part of our book club a couple of years ago. It's one of my favorite memoirs ever. Essentially, this book covers, I think, 7 walks that Raja took over the space of about 30 years through the Palestinian hills where he lives. And through those walks, I mean, we get this really lush, beautiful nature writing, but we also get to see like the change in the Palestinian landscape. And it's all very gentle, and like I would describe this book as generous. Like that's the feeling I got while reading it. But you know, through his experiences and through his walks, Raja also talks about his experience being Palestinian, and also his experience being a lawyer, and like his journey trying to represent his people fighting against dispossession. So if you have still not read anything about Palestine yet, and some of the other book recommendations just feel like a bit too dense or heavy for you, I think that this is a really great gateway in, because like I said, there's just so much nature writing. It's so beautiful. There's so much breathing space in this book, I suppose, but equally it's so honest as well. One of my favorite books ever. Highly recommend. Another one of my favorite books, which is a little bit of a harder read, but still just one of the best books I've ever read. This was recommended to me by my friend Sonia years ago, and I have recommended it subsequently to so many other people since. This Is Not a Border, and it's an anthology. So basically it's a bunch of authors, writers, poets, artists who have attended the Palestine Festival of Literature, and they have provided entries in this book about their experience and their time there. So it's one of the most diverse collections, one of the most diverse anthologies I've ever read in terms of the people who are represented, but also in terms of like the way that they've presented their entries. Like some of them have written essays, some of them have written short stories, some of it's poetry, but all of it is just so incredible and so personal and beautifully written. Like these people, they're writers, they know how to write, and I just loved it. And there's been some things that have just really stayed with me since reading this. I think especially the word apartheid and how it absolutely applies to the occupation and Israel and what they're doing. That was made very clear to me in this book. And then the other thing, I honestly can't remember which writer said it, but I swear there was a writer in here who said something to the effect of basically that Palestine and what's happening in Palestine, the occupation of Palestine, the dispossession of Palestinians, is the great moral failing of the West in the modern day. And I think this book will make it very clear as to why the West has failed Palestine so deeply and in so many ways. Okay, I'm gonna have to pick up the pace a little bit because I've got a lot of books to recommend. This is a short story collection. It's called Palestine Plus 100 Stories from a Century After the Nakba. It's a speculative fiction kind of anthology. There's one story in particular. While I enjoyed the whole anthology, there was one that was just kind of like one of the best short stories I've ever read. It's called The Key by Anwar Hamad. So if you are able to find this book, great. If not, try and find that short story another way, because it's just, I think I described it on Instagram as one of the most affecting and atmospheric stories I've ever read. It's based on the idea that in 1948, when many Palestinians were displaced from their homes for the first time by Israel, many of them left with their keys on a necklace around their neck because they assumed that they would be returning once everything kind of settled down in a week or two or a couple of months. And there are like elderly people who still wear those keys to their homes that were stolen from them around their necks today, or now their descendants wear those keys around their necks. And it's basically a ghost story inspired by that. And it's incredible. Amazing. If you were after more of like a graphic novel, Squire is an incredible graphic novel. It's not explicitly about Palestine, but one of the creators is a Palestinian American. And although it is like a little bit fantastical, I think it is a pretty strong kind of like allegory for Palestine. It explores things like colonial violence, propaganda. It's beautiful. This is just a proof, so it's all in black and white. But this book, if you buy it, it's all in full color and the art's just incredible. Then a poetry collection that I just loved is Mural by Mahmoud Darwish. This, I think, includes the last poem he wrote before he died, and it's just glorious. Like we know I'm not like a big poetry expert, but this would be one of my favorite poetry collections I've ever read. Now on to the books by Aboriginal authors, which I think is also important, especially if you're in Australia right now, to be engaging with Aboriginal voices. I think the very, very loud no, which honestly, I was expecting the voice to the referendum to fail, but I was not expecting it to fail as hard as it did, and for every state to vote majority no. I was shocked. And how loud and big that no vote was is now being used as justification for politicians on all sides and on all levels to kind of roll back many commitments that they've made to the Aboriginal people. Some states are already starting to kind of like take back their promise to negotiate treaty in the wake of the no. They're kind of taking this as a mandate to not have to listen to Aboriginal people. Like the voice was a very particular body that was proposed, but the Aboriginal voice more generally, it's almost like Australia voted no to listening to that at all. And it's horrific. So we need to be engaging with those voices. I've got a couple of fiction books to recommend. The first is, of course, The Yield by Tara June Winch. I've spoken about this book a lot, probably not as much in the last year or so, but it's one of the best Australian books I've ever read. It's an intergenerational story about land rights and language, and it's amazing. Another book that I do love in hindsight, it was hard to read, but I genuinely think it's one of the best books I've ever read, is Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. This is a weird book. It's really unconventional. It's kind of speculative, kind of magical realism, but also just like more brutally honest than almost any fiction book I've ever read. And the ending, the message of the ending, I think did change the way that I see myself as a white person and a settler on this land. It's a work of art, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. It's brilliant. Now we've got some non-fiction. I've spoken about all of these on my channel at some point. If you want to just start with something quite small, Truth, Tradition and Tomorrow by Galora Yunupingu. Amazing. This is like a very, very small kind of volume of him just talking about his experience trying to navigate the Australian bureaucracy to achieve land rights for his people. Another collection of poetry, I would say, although this feels more like mantras. There's something really quite guttural and spiritual, but also very, very political about this book. It's Living on Stolen Land by Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner. I love this book. At once a call and a guide to action, this beautifully articulated declaration is a must-read for anyone interested in decolonising Australia. Challenging, thought-provoking, empowering. Absolutely. Then a book that I read a couple of years ago, It's Our Country. This is edited by Megan Davis and Marsha Langton. This is basically a collection of entries from different Aboriginal people, from different positions and areas and walks of life, talking about constitutional recognition and their thoughts on it. Obviously, like this is, when was this published? Like 2017 or something? 2016. So it's obviously, it feels maybe like it's a little bit dated now, especially in the wake of the referendum. But I think in terms of exploring what constitutional recognition could look like, this was a great piece of work. I think it's also really important to read books like this and be reminded of the fact that no group is a monolith. I heard some people talking about how, you know, how could Australians vote yes if not all Aboriginal people wanted us to vote yes? And it's like, there is no group ever who has agreed on one thing. Like, to expect them to is just to dehumanize them entirely. Apologies, my camera died. again, so let's just get through these last books quickly. We have Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. This is kind of like an Australian classic at this point. There's an audiobook for this one. You need to read it. It basically challenges the colonial history that so many of us were taught in school. It's the re-education that pretty much every Australian citizen, especially settlers, need. Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta is just an amazing book, and essentially it challenges a very Western white supremacist lens. It talks about a lot of different things, including our relationship to the environment, the necessity of viewing ourselves as interconnected rather than like, you know, individuals. It talks about privilege, gender, a whole host of topics. It's really good. Then I have a couple of memoirs that I know I've spoken about plenty on this channel, and I think even on my previous channel I was talking about Maybe Tomorrow by Burry Monty Pryor. A beautiful memoir, very easy to read. Honestly, like this would be the sort of thing that would be appropriate for older teens as well. And then one of my favorite books of all time is My Place by Sally Morgan. This book is a little bit slow to start, but it's just incredible. It's one of the first like own voices Aboriginal memoirs that was published in Australia. So I think that's everything I've got for you today. I just wanted to kind of like lean into all of the big feelings that I've been having this week rather than ignoring them and trying to look away. I know there's a lot of grief and anger and frustration and hurt and hopelessness kind of circulating around so many of us at the moment for different reasons. There's a lot of community and power to be found at the moment in the midst of what feels like a really dark time. And so while it might feel easier, especially for some of us who are more disconnected from these realities, to just look away, I think it's important that, yes, we take care of ourselves, but we take care of ourselves so that we can be of service. I think it's really important right now not to like fall victim to the idea of individualistic thinking. We are not separate from what's going on right now. If you're in Australia, regardless of how you voted, like you live on a country that is stolen land, and we need to reckon with that individually and as a collective. If you live in a country like Australia, Canada, France, England, America, you are not disconnected from the realities of what's happening in Palestine right now. Your country, your leaders support Israel. And I think that is not only because there are vested interests and all of that in the colonial structure of Israel, but I think it's also because to reckon with what Israel is doing and has been doing and the colonialism inherent in the system of Israel would be to hold a mirror to our own situations as well. And it just seems like so many of us are unwilling to do that. So yes, take care of yourself, take care of the people around you, but don't look away. Don't refuse to look in that mirror. I'm not saying I have an answer. I suppose I'm just kind of talking to you as much as I am to myself. So that's where I am right now. That's where I've been this week. And those are some of the books that have been helping me frame what's going on and helping me think about what's going on, but also to sustain me while I continue showing up in resistance to what's going on. So if you'd like to, feel free to leave any other book recommendations in the comments below that you might have that are relevant to what we've been talking about today. Thank you if you've made it all the way to the end. A big thank you as always to my patrons over on Patreon, and especially a big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And hopefully I'll see you again next week. Until then, much love. Bye.